Alright, so I mentioned we're going to talk about notation. So that's what this first video is going to be about, notation, musical notation. And so, first, two quick disclaimers. The first is that we're going to focus on the Western classical music tradition and try to also bring out some, underrepresented artists throughout the duration of this experience. But we are going to focus on that type of music primarily because it's something I'm a little bit more comfortable with. So don't, if something's said and you're like, oh, that's not that, for example, we'll talk about some of the first pieces of music. I'm well aware there are other first pieces of music that go back even further, other traditions, but don't, take that as, a lack of knowledge or some kind of incorrect statement. It might just be, because we're focusing on this specific lens of the Western classical music canon. And then secondly, if I do misspeak and happen to say something that's incorrect and you know it and you have some resources, please link those in the comments. Provide those resources for me. That would be much appreciated. And feel free to provide that insight so that myself and others, I can make the correction and others can also see the correction as quickly as possible. Because that is the goal. To kind of expand education, and I'm not perfect whatsoever. But yeah, so we're going to start by talking about music. So the first thing we need to kind of consider is how music is shared. As musicians and non-musicians, I think, know, music is written usually in sheet music. Some people do it by ear as well. It's very popular in the jazz realm. And so music is shared by sheet music primarily. That's how we transfer music to one another. We write it down, and we share it, and someone else can replicate it. That's kind of the whole point. And then technical aspects of the music are often more verbal. Your professor might tell someone, okay, you need to perform it in this way, or it might be some kind of other various, oh, this is the dynamic contour you're supposed to have, or maybe you're supposed to do something technically that's not written down. So that's kind of how it's currently shared, and so that's kind of how the current mode is. But in the past, they would transfer all of it by ear. Music was orally, it was transferred by ear, and so they would pass it down. They'd have to remember it, and eventually some people got tired of that and decided, hey, let's write this thing down instead, so it's a little bit easier, or make some kind of notes to help remember what it's supposed to sound like, and then eventually they translated into just writing it down on a staff at some point, and so on and so forth. Dynamics, etc., are notated in as we travel through time. And so one of the earliest pieces that we will take a look at in just one quick second is Puernotus, which is a very early musical score from the Catholic Church. I believe it's Christmas Mass, if I'm correct. So we're just going to take a second. I'm going to put it up on the screen, and we're going to take a look at that and just kind of observe what it looks like, and then we'll talk about some of the different types of notation and developments that occurred. Alright, so moving on, we're going to see on the screen, you see Puernotus, which I mentioned before. This is one of the earliest forms of music notation that we have written down. You'll notice right away that there's two notations actually here on the screen. And we'll talk about some of the different types of notations that existed and how those kind of developed. But if you just look, you see kind of like a equivalent to what a modern staff would look like, with some squares and different little pitch patterns. And we'll talk about that at some point in the near future. And you'll see above it, you'll see little squiggly lines, which again indicate kind of contour of little pitch patterns on the various syllables that are notated in words underneath in the Latin. And so I think it's important, before we move on to those different types of notation, to quickly discuss why we wanted to make music notation in the first place. We mentioned, for ease of listening, and then being able to perform it, it gave them a reminder of what to perform rather than having to remember everything, every type of chant. But also, it was a political move. So Charlemagne, this Holy Roman Empire, when he was in charge, he wanted to standardize music so he had a sense of political control over the different churches in the empire, because a lot of them were performing different forms of the chants. And so this caused, obviously, conflict, as you would expect. Some people were given notation, and they were like, that's not how it's performed this way. So it just did cause some tension and some issues. When does it not, when it comes to music or any kind of discourse? But this was a political move, in addition to being just, it would make it easier to sing kind of move. this would make it so that each church was performing the exact same type of music. And this wasn't actually the earliest notation, and we're going to quickly cut to that in just a second. But this is one of the earliest forms of notation. The earliest is actually just some dots and slashes, and I'll kind of demonstrate how that looks in just a second. But yeah, this is the one of the earliest forms and written forms of Western music notation, and this chant happens to be a Christmas piece about, I think, for a Christmas mass, Puernotus. And so now I think we should move on to looking at the other forms of notation that exist and kind of explaining all of them. All right, so we've talked about, kind of what we're in store for, but what we actually have to look at before that is we got dots and slashes. That's all we had. That was what we had for music notation, dots and slashes. Dots a lower note or the same note, slash is a higher note or the same higher note. So if you look above, we've got dot, dot, slash. That could be any one of these things. I got a piano next to me. You could have, that could be dot, dot, slash. That could be dot, dot, slash. Actually, that can't be dot, dot, slash. Excuse me. That could be dot, dot, slash. It could be anything. So, I encourage you to take a song that you enjoy. Maybe it's, Happy Birthday. Maybe it's, I don't know, Industry Baby. That's a popular one. Take any song you want. And try notating it with that. Just, listen, especially if you're a musician and you understand interval relationships, just listen, okay, is it higher, is it lower, and just try to write the melody out using that notation. It's a fun little activity to do, why not? But that's what we had at the beginning, and so as you'd expect, no way that could be where we stopped. So that's where we get into the notation that we saw in the previous section, Puernotus, because they needed to find a way to heighten pitches to represent a specific set of intervals, or eventually getting actual discrete notes. So where we have C written down, and you can then play a C, and it's not just and then you go up to some note, and then you go down to some note. Then you would have to know where you start at. This eventually we get to a point where you don't have to know what the starting note is; it's written down for you. You don't have to remember it based on training. So we're gonna take a look at some of these notations in just a second. And so now we get to this time of discrete pitches and some contour being mapped out, not just dots and slashes. And so if you look over here, we have the punctum, with just like a dot, looks like a square. We saw this in these ones in the Puernotus on the actual staff. If you look over here, we have the clevis, which is a type of two-note pattern, but it's not exclusively the only two-note pattern. This just happens to be an example I chose. And then above we have the torculus, which is another example of a three-note pattern, but it again is not the only type of three-note pattern. And these are just some ways that music was notated. And then if you look at other types of notation, we have a Beneventan notation, which is where we see those squiggles above, and those are derived in similar ways to having dots and little, one, it might look like a little fish hook that might represent going up and then down the note. You might have something that represents kind of like, it looks like an S, what we think of as an S, and that might be going from a low to a high to a low note again, and all sorts of heightened neumes that indicate more intervallic relationships than just dot and slash representing low high. So now we're getting into territory of actually having some kind of system to go from a pitch to a specific pitch back down to another specific pitch, or up to another pitch, or whatever it is, rather than just having note goes up or note goes down. So this is the next advancement we kind of get into during around the time 1030s, 850 to 900 when we start seeing any form of this, but 1030 is where we start seeing specifically double notation with those discrete pitches that we saw in the Puernotus example. All right, so the big question is, how did this all come about? Well, we've got this little staff, we've got these little dots now, with the torculus or the clevis or whatever it may be, and this kind of was. The double notation was not invented by this person, Guido de Arezzo. However, early staff notation was, because he saw the need for younger musicians who were not able to remember these melodies to have some kind of reference point. And so he made a staff so that the discrete pitches could be marked. This is around that 1025 period. of time. And so that's where the staff notation first started coming from, and that's why we have an F and a C clef. Those were the two clefs at the time, an F clef and a C clef. One would mark where the F was, and one would mark where the C was on the line. Not so different from today, with the treble and bass clef marking certain pitches and where it starts. So that was the point of the F and the C clef back then. It was very clear, very basic, and it would mark where the note C was, and then those little dots would be used to notate, okay, we're going up to this note and down to this note, and it would mark those patterns out. So where do we go from there? Well, we don't have rhythm at this point. We only have pitches. So we have a note and a syllable, and so you might have, Puernotus, and you got, okay, this is the note C, and you sing some length of time this part, and you sing some length of time this part, and that's all we got. So around the 1100s, 1200s, we start to get rhythm and breakdowns of rhythm. And this comes in the Ars Nova period during the Renaissance. So the Ars Nova means new art, and so what they were starting to do was to break down time. They were learning about breaking down time into divisions. Part of this comes because of the mechanical clock, possibly being invented around this time. They kind of maybe expanded into music and tried to break down music into infinite time, essentially, and how you break that down. And so we get different divisions of time relative to a certain pulse or meter or beat, as we would define it now. And so the breve becomes this overarching unit of the held out note. And so we get two divisions to form sort of a meter per se, and they might have defined this back then as maybe a mode of rhythm instead of a meter, but that's how we think of it today, as a meter. And so you get divisions of 3 and divisions of 2. That's how we divide things. And if you look at music nowadays, that's pretty much the same thing. Even though 4/4 is the standard for a lot of music, that's still a division of 2. It's just 4 beats, but it's still a multiple of 2. So you could really define it as, something that's divided in 2 and then divided into 2 a second time. You divide your whole note into 2, you get 2 half notes, and you divide that again to get 2 quarter notes per that half note. That's kind of how you could look at it. And ironically, despite the fact that we listen to 4/4 now, or not listen to 4/4, but perform lots of stuff in 4/4, that's kind of the basic units that you would start off with the younger students. That's actually the exact opposite of what it would be back then. They actually, because they were very Catholic and Christian, they were very holy people, and that's how their music was based on religion. They actually divided things in 3 because of the Holy Trinity. So you get these 2 different divisions. You have the Tempest, which is represented by the breve, being divided, and the Prolatio, which is the next division down, essentially. And so Tempest Perfectum, which would be signified by a circle, as you see right here, without a dot in it, is Tempest Perfectum. Well, actually, we'll get to the dot in a second, but Tempest Perfectum is represented by a circle, and Tempest Imperfectum is represented by a half circle. Tempest Perfectum is the division of the breve into 3, and the Tempest Imperfectum is a division by 2. That's the two levels that you can divide it by. And then the next step down, dividing those divisions, you can divide it into either major, which is a division of 3, and that does have a dot. So Tempest Perfectum major would be a circle with a dot in it. That would be a division of 3, and then a division of 3, which would be equivalent of 9/8 today, or something like that. A Tempest Imperfectum with a dot would be the equivalent of a division of 2 with divisions of 3, so like a 6/8 today, where you have 2 beats, macro beats, and then 3 beats inside of those, 3 smaller beats. If you look at the minor Prolatio, that means there's no dot. That would be a division of 3 with divisions of 2, so maybe a 3/4, where you have 3 beats divided into 8 notes. And that would be represented with a dot with no, a circle with no dot, rather. And then Tempest Imperfectum minor would be a half circle with no dot, so you just have your little curve, and that represents something like 2/2 or 4/4. So that's the worst in their eyes, to those who were holding on to the earlier period and weren't a fan of this Ars Nova period, this new art. They would see that as one of the worst rhythmic modes to utilize, because it was a division of 2 and a division of 2, which is not the 3 and 3, which is what the Holy Trinity represented. And so you see these different examples as I've illustrated, and that was where we started getting into divisions of rhythmic notation. And this is an exciting time, because now we're having metrical, and we have these discrete pitches that we've had for about 100, 200 years at this point. And now we're starting to be able to, when we look back at this music now, we can actually kind of figure out exactly what they were trying to sing, because they're utilizing these more not exotic rhythms per se, but they're the exotic rhythm in the fact that they are notating it finally around this time, and we can actually see what they were going to be performing this music like, because we have the pitches and the rhythms now, which is a very exciting development. And now we've reached the end of our very general overview on musical notation's evolution. And so the last two things I think are worthy of noting is the first, dynamic markings started around the late 1500s, early 1600s, thanks to Giovanni Gabrieli, where he was notating the different dynamics between two different choirs that were singing on stage at the same time. This is around the beginnings of opera and everything like that. And then the Gutenberg printing press and the digital age. Both those things can be credited to advancements in musical notation as well. Before the Gutenberg printing press, the music wasn't as widespread. The rise of the piano around that same time led to a lot of people getting music in their homes, and a lot of amateur musicians developing. But the Gutenberg printing press helped with transmitting a lot more music, kind of spreading the variety of music across various areas and lands. And in addition to that, it also helped with the increase in more high quality notation, rather than just having so much handwritten notation that was poor. You now have a little bit better quality notation, and computers kind of contribute that to another extent. Now you have digitized notation, in addition to being able to hear it while you're writing it. So a lot more advancements in musical notation. There's plenty of other current modern advancements that we could talk about. We could talk about some of the other things. We could break down exactly when dynamic marking started appearing, when crescendos started appearing and everything. But this was just a general overview of kind of the really, really key changes, which were adding contour, adding specific pitches, and adding the rhythm to notation to approach what we have in modern day. So, with that being said, this is the end of the first video. I'm glad you all have joined me today on this journey. I'm not sure what video will be next, but stay tuned for the next musical area we'll explore. Maybe there'll be a specific time period. Maybe we'll explore another kind of progression of something in music, maybe a certain instrument or something. If you have any ideas or things you're interested in, feel free to put reply in the comments below for what I've always wanted to say that for what you are interested in learning about, and I'll dig in and do some research. And don't hesitate to give your own information that I can put into a video and give you a shout out. Thanks for joining, and continue the quest for knowledge.